discussion of the recently launched book, India's First Democratic Revolution, Dayanand Bandodkar and the Rise of the Bahujan in Goa, authored by our very own Professor Parag, Porobo. The way we're going to structure the evening, this discussion, is I'll ask Parag to say a couple of words about the book, subsequent to which we begin our discussion of the book. So without any further ado, Parag, would you like to tell us about the book? I'll do that.
Thanks, Jason. If you look at Goan historiography, the way Goa has been engaged in academic sense, we basically have two frameworks. One is the framework of Goa Dorada, and the other is the framework called Goa Indica. Now, what is very interesting is that both these frameworks are quite opposite, yet they are close. Close in the sense they both originate in elite locations. If you look at Goa Dorada, this is basically the idea of the happy Portuguese empire. You have Golden Empire, which is largely a creation of the early 20th century. And on the other side, you have the idea of Goa Indica, largely a creation by the nationalists, which is out there to erase, I will say, what colonialism did to Goa. This work, in that sense, brings up a third dimension to engage with Goa. It's the Bahujan perspective, trying to look at Goa by seeing through Dayanand Bandodkar and his agency for Goa. Now, when you look at the way Goa has been engaged in terms of academics, we often give importance to British colonialism. And you have British colonialism being eventually imposed on Goa. Now, what this book does, it deviates from this practice and tries to locate Goa between two colonialisms. One, the Portuguese colonialism, which was there, and the other, British colonialism, which didn't colonize Goa, but since 19th centuries, you have Britishers informally dominating over Goa. And large number of changes that came to Goa since 19th century and all were actually driven from outside, largely from colonial Bombay. This work argues in terms of democratic processes that actually shaped Goa since 1963. For most of you who have a tourist idea about Goa, Goa happens to be the first place where we have a government which was based largely on the ideology of Bahujan Samaj. Goa happens to be the place where we had second non-Congress government after Kerala. So when you talk about Kerala, you have communist ideology playing an important role. When you talk about Goa, you have a new party being created just before the elections, which is led by Dayanand Bandodkar, and I will always refer to him as lower caste capitalist, who used his capital to bring together Bahujan Samaj and eventually took on Congress in 1963, 67 and 72. What is very interesting is that in these three elections, first and the third contested formally by Congress, second was contested by Congress candidates but not by the Congress party formally. You don't find Congress winning a single seat in Goa. And on two occasions in 1963 and 1972, you have Congress getting one seat in Daman, but that was not in Goa. So this book largely engages with the issues like how this Bahujan as a category emerged in Goa, what was the role of Bandodkar in getting lower caste together, and since power came to the lower caste at the very first democratic election, how this was different in terms of other parts of India. So therefore I talk about the changes that came about, largely focused on land reforms. These land reforms were largely different from what actually happened to other parts of India. Because in other parts of India, you have land reforms being implemented by the dominant caste, whereas here you have a lower caste leader implementing the land reforms. And this was very quick, which eventually destroyed the feudal relationship when it comes to Goan society. Then he went ahead with education, largely focused on primary education, and this was very different from what Nehru was doing and imagining for the entire nation at large. There were large investment when you talk about in terms of health, and if you look at the government budgetary allocations and all, almost 48% was being invested in health and education. So these are the remarkable features that we see, which eventually transformed Goa.
Thank you, Parag. So I think this evening we're kind of really blessed, as it were, to have a range of diverse and spectacular persons to discuss the book. To my right, we have Professor Shahid Amin, who is, for those of you who study history or generally social science in South Asia, would not be a name that needs introduction. He's done some excellent work on the Chauri Chaura incident and has recently retired from Delhi University and is currently in Goa as part of the Visiting Research Professor program. Did I get it right? Yes. Yeah? And under the D.D. Kosambi chair. To his right, we have Professor Anjali Arondekar, who is at the University of California in Santa Cruz, right? And is in the Department of Gender Studies and Sexuality, and has been doing really interesting work on the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, and is also interested in the larger questions more recently about Portuguese colonialism. To my left, we have once again an individual who for Goans should need no introduction, the member of the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Vishnu Wagh, who in addition to being a politician actually has had an earlier life and perhaps is still continuing life as a playwright, as a poet, and as a man of letters more generally. Before I hand the mic over to them, however, as moderator, I'm going to have my kind of privilege of just saying a few words about the book, just also kind of echoing of Parag. I think this book is a very welcome addition to the scholarly work on Goa, right? For at least three reasons. One, there is a rightful shift of emphasis from an obsession with the Portuguese towards the internal oppressors. So there's a focus on the internal politics and the internal bad guys, as it were, which is something that isn't really done very much because we're constantly obsessed with the external figure of the Portuguese. Secondly, I think the book is important because it opens up the possibility to have a scholarly dialogue, right? There are lots of these other dialogues that are going on, but a scholarly dialogue on post-colonial history that is sensitive to lower caste perspectives. In this sense, also, the book is a major shift. Though having said it, also joins a number of recent works that are trying to make this shift. So in that sense, Parag is part of a wave that hopefully will inundate us very soon and lead to all kinds of exciting possibilities in the way in which we read Goan history. And finally, and I think this is perhaps the most important, is that it ends the silence on Bandodkar. When I was doing my work, my doctoral work, what really bothered me and amazed me was that for a man who is so... Bandodkar is not a figure you can ignore. You either love him or hate him in Goa. For this kind of a figure, that there had been no serious scholarly work done was something really remarkable. And because this book comes out, it allows us now to begin discussing Bandodkar in various perspectives, in various ways. Hopefully this discussion that we're going to start will perhaps be just a trailer of what is to come. So I will first hand the mic over to Professor Amin, and the floor is all yours now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must begin by thanking the University of Goa for having extended an invitation to somebody who is from the Gangetic heartland. It's interesting, Gangetic land is not enough in North India. It has to be the Gangetic heartland. So, as it were, I come from insular India, as opposed to, and I'm here now in peninsular India, and we have really a major curtain of ignorance as far as non-British colonial part of the subcontinent is concerned. So I'm really here under a false pretense, to lapse into Hindustani. मैं आया नहीं हूँ, लाया गया हूँ, because this is not really. It's a very, very dense, in the good sense of the term, work. It addresses large and mixed and several constituencies. It raises very important issues about how do you write a history of a region which is not a part of perceived mainstream history of India and yet claim to be a first. It's interesting that the title is India's first democratic revolution. So there is a challenge and shall we say an irony involved over here, which really asks us to rework the way we have really been satisfied with writing the history of India within a nationalist perspective, and then annexing literally and figuratively other histories to the broad nationalist cause. So it's a challenging title, but the title also, if one was to be slightly critical, in a way rebounds on itself, because for Goa to claim a first for India post 61 is to really de-link itself from a larger colonial period and enter into or challenge the mainstream view of Indian nationalism in a marginal sort of way. And so that's both the success of the book, and on the other hand, as it were, it is also ceding too much ground to India. Because if the internal dynamics of Goan society, you see, for British India, the success of nationalism is that it builds an enemy England and British rule as opposed to all of Indians. That is why the early nationalist economic writers like Dadabhai Naoroji or R.P. Dutt and so on always emphasize the revenue extracted by the colonial state as really causing India's economic backwardness, while we all know that the revenue was only 30 to 40% of the total surplus that was extracted by the landlords from the tenants. So the building of a nationalist narrative for large chunks of India was really predicated on writing away of the internal contradictions within India, and that applied especially to caste oppression. We tended to write histories of India under colonialism purely in terms of the category economic for a country where money didn't really dominate everything. To borrow a phrase of Marx, it was not the universal expression of every value. So that we grew up on all Indians versus colonial rule, and over here, and we also had our own views of India, and one of the major lacunae was a complete absence, a complete mismatch between what we memorialized as major events or dates in the nationalist calendar. The fact that nobody really ever thought seriously while writing histories of India that 1510 happens in India much before 1526 happens in India. 1526 is the beginning of the establishment of the Mughal Empire. That interestingly, it is Portuguese exertions and basically Iberian spread in Latin America that really underwrites the economic prosperity and the growth of money economy in Mughal India. Because rupiah, of course, literally, meaning silver, ties what is happening in the mints of Agra and other places to a worldwide empire of Iberian, of the Iberian countries. So there is a way in which we are in North India completely ignorant of the histories of Goa, which raises then the issue: how does one? And this came up in a panel that I just attended an hour and a half ago about rewriting histories. What would be the alternative histories that we could write about Goa? Soon enough, perhaps to use to challenge Parag to think through it a bit. So if this book becomes a major landmark in a new writing of the history of Goa, what could be the alternatives on the ground to a book that is focused on a canonical personality? Can we write then for Goa with this opening that Parag's book provides, small histories of everyday pain, suffering, gender, local issues, which are not tagged to a political march towards democracy within an institutional structure created by a newly emergent foreign formation, literally. 1961, the Indian Constitution is a foreign formation in all senses of the terms, in terms of languages, and this happens very markedly with while on the one hand, the intimate enemy for mainstream India is the English, and therefore the intimate enemies are our intimate rulers, that is the ICS. In Goa, obviously, there's a big disjunct between indigenous bureaucracy and what is imposed. So I was just wondering, I'm just trying to mark this book as an important book by asking the question, what would be the way in which the histories of Goa could be written, which don't necessarily contribute to Goan history, but histories as it happens in Goa. Because the more you write Goan history, or the more we write Indian history, you are in effect restricting the readership to a community of affect, to people who feel about this. But histories, like novels written from the subcontinent, must travel abroad. They must have, while located in a specific area, must lay an insistent and an arrogant and a conceited claim to be read as histories that happened in one part of the globe, rather than as Indian histories or Goan history. Because the more we try to experiment with writing about particular regions or events or small groups, but in a way that defamiliarizes the familiar and makes the unfamiliar familiar to other regions, so that we might be writing about events that have been abbreviated, that have been shunned away, which would be not recognizable as memorable events even in Goa. But on the other hand, the mode of writing would be such that it becomes available as events that are intelligible to people who don't know either about India or Goa. So I see this as an opening, so that it's not. So the first step is to argue in some ways, as Parag does, that this is a writing of a kind of a subordinated or subaltern history. But I'm asking Parag and others who would now form a new generation of historians of India to try and unsettle the dominant narratives, which have to be dominant narratives, because narratives of political success are invariably dominant narratives, which are in effect, as some of us have argued for North India, based on a lack of fit between the leaders and the masses, a lack of fit between what is said and the way it is understood, a lack of fit between the organization and the movement, so that any movement, when it becomes important, transcends the institutionalized political forms through which it attains political power. And that is the story which needs to be, I think, not only in terms of the also ran, but in terms of a complex dynamic between even subordinated political leadership and their attempt to mold in their own image, a vast multitude which must of necessity, even if you are a Dalit leader, be different from the leader concerned. Not every Bahujan Samaj leader could be a mine owner and just as well, knowing what is happening to the ecology of Goa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Amin. I'd now ask I'd invite MLA Wagh to say a few words.
Thank you. I'll directly speak on the book written by Parag and the contents therein. I think we must congratulate Parag for having come out with a very different book that gives a total different outlook about Goa's social structure, the hegemony of casteism, the impact of colonialism, and such other subjects. If you read the book carefully, you will find that there are many inadequacies in the book itself. There ought to have been more work done in some other fields. You should have thrown more light, but this is my reminiscence. But at the same time, I think he has dared to touch a subject which has been treated in Goa like a holy cow, which almost is treated like a taboo, despite the impact of destruction that it left for over so many centuries. First of all, I think Parag has presented Goa historically, socially, culturally through his book. And while doing this, he has tried to assess what has been the position of the so-called Bahujan Samaj here when Portuguese came here, especially after the 18th century. And after the Portuguese left, what was the impact, what was the surge, what was the instinct that made them come in front and fight out an electoral battle and win it. Of course, I feel privileged here to sit as a writer, poet and a playwright. But it's extremely volatile for me to speak here as a politician. Well, one word I'll speak, and if it gets misrecorded and misrepresented, then there'll be another debate which will start on this. First of all, let us consider one thing. Most of us have a perception that entire Goa, that geographically is existing today, was under the Portuguese rule right from 1510. This is not so. Different territories of Goa were captured by the Portuguese at different times. And what we called as the old conquest and the new conquest, the social situation, the cultural situation shows a distinct difference. There's a sharp difference in the old conquistas and the new conquistas. First, the Portuguese captured Tiswadi. My village, Dongri, happened to be one of the first villages. They were captured by Portuguese. They captured Tiswadi, then they captured Salset, then they captured Bardes, and then they captured Mormugao. This process was almost over by the beginning of the 17th century. After that, there was a long gap. And all the new conquistados, with Fonda, Sattari, Pedne, Bicholim, Ashtagar, that is Kepe, and Kankon, they came in the hand of Portuguese at a much later time. By that time, the social structure of in all these places of Hindu society was more or less intact, which had come from the beginning itself. Here, changes had taken place because there were conversions. Lot many people were converted into Christianity. They accepted it as a religion. New literature was created for them in their language or in a created language. That's what Parag says in his observations, and I think that is very important. We must understand the historical aspect of this. So we have two distinct Goas within one Goa now, and that we are carrying still ahead. What the movement which was started, political movement, which was called Maharashtradi Gomantak Party, was largely an impact of the new conquistados which were later conquered by the Portuguese. More of the revolution came from all these new conquests, not the old conquests. Even now, wherever there is a debate on any political issue, the response of North Goa is different, the response of South Goa is different. We don't respond equally to all problems in all parts of the state. Let us accept this as a fact. So while Parag tells us that what miseries the Bahujan Samaj had to face in the earlier times, these miseries are not related only to the advent of Portuguese. They were here even before that. The very fact that Goa's history is directly linked with Skanda Puran of Sahyadri, I think that is a big deficit that we have made to ourselves by believing in that Sahyadri Khand. It is not a historical account. It is just a literary account. There might be names of this thing, but it cannot be perceived per se as history. Let us accept it. And then in all our documents we find, in all the material that is presented about Goa, we find the legend of Parshuram. And we have the same hoax of a story telling us that Parshuram shot an arrow and the sea went back and the land was created. We are still living in this hallucination, I must say. And that because it appears on all government records and all government literature, people take it for face value and they believe that indeed this land was created by Parshuram. Who was Parshuram? Parshuram, the history tells us, he was the destroyer of all Kshatriyas. History tells us that Parshuram killed Kshatriyas 21 times. And just because that Kashyap Rishi got angry, he told him, you now get out from my land and you go and settle in some ancient land, I don't know, alien land, and you go from here. That's why he was outcasted. And that's how he came along this coast. But I would like to ask, were there no settlements here? Were there no people living here? The entire coast of Konkan is rich with different things like coconuts, cashews and all that. Cashews came after the Portuguese, but coconuts were there. There was the sea, so there must have been fishermen. If the coconut was there, there must have been the toddy tapper. All these communities, in fact, they were there. And historically, if you go to take the account of even Ramayana, apart from its linguistic and literature value, you will find that there were certain tribes which were residing in the west coast of India, which now you find them even in Goa, in Maharashtra, in Karnataka, in Kerala also. This matter of continuity has been neglected. See, when we say that the Saraswats as a caste, they came and settled in Goa, and then they developed. They had good proximity to the Portuguese rulers, so they were employed in the offices. They had access to records. They could write the records themselves, or they could create the records also. That was vice versa. Like this way, many records must have been created. Who knows? Because there were no educated people coming from the common masses and who were serving the Portuguese. They were totally out of administration. This proximity with administration gave an upper hand to certain people who reaped all the benefit of it for their own benefit. And then the entire social structure of Goa became colonized. The feeling of colonialism that we are next to the Portuguese came to the mind of a certain section, and then all this casteism started. This is my perception. And why I am saying it, Parag, is because, see, it was not happening only in Goa. Same things were happening even in Mumbai at that time. When Mumbai was just being established, it was given to Portuguese and then there were settlements and this thing. But before that also, Mumbai had certain kings. They were called Bhongli kings. And the original inhabitants of Mumbai were the Agaris, the Bhandaris, the Kolis. These were the original settlers. Even when the British Army created their first police force, which we now call the Maharashtra Police Force, the name of that Maharashtra Police Force, first created by the British, was Bhandari Militia. Because they had employed all the people who were in the service of the Bhongli king into their service, and they were made the police force of the ancient Mumbai. These things were happening there. Goan people were traveling there. A lot of people from Goa traveled to Mumbai. They settled there. And they were from all communities. They were from Saraswats. There were a lot of people going from Govindak Maratha Samaj to Mumbai that time. There were a lot of people going to Goa from Bandari Samaj. They all settled there. There was a churning of thoughts in Mumbai also. And when the Brahman Parishad was established in Mumbai, as a response to that, Guruji Kiroskar and Ramakrishna, Sitaram Keshav Bole, C.K. Bole, they both came together. They established Brahmanetar Samaj Parishad in Mumbai. That was the first challenge that was given to the intellectual authority of the Saraswats. We have this conflict from that time onwards. And Goa had direct links with Mumbai because I know that many ships used to go up to Mumbai, to the north, and up to Cochin to the south from Goa. They were doing trade. And all these people knew what was happening in Bombay, that was coming here, that was reaching here. So the Samajis, Bahujan Samajis, which were silent, they also began thinking. Bandari Samaj had, in 1926, they organized Bandari Shikshan Parishad in Goa. At a time when everybody, when Bahu Sahib was just born a few years before that. We were still in Portuguese rule. But they had the tendency to have Bandari Shikshan Parishad, which was inspired by Bole and Kiroskar and all these other leaders who were settled there. So the awareness about education was already being done. Even amongst Gomantak Maratha Samaj, there were people like Rajaram Rangaji Painginkar, who wrote a small booklet, Mi Kon. He wrote a very small booklet, but that created ripples even at that time. There were people like, I'll take a name called Dayanand Bandodkar, who was the first principal of Almed College, but who presented a bill in the Portuguese Assembly asking the Portuguese government to stop the Sexuality, which was done and which was felt as a disgrace by Govindak Maratha Samaj. These were progressive steps taken at that time, and I think all this had culminated into whatever happened after 1961. I personally think, you have made a mention of it, we must salute as sincerely as we salute Bahujan Bandodkar, we also must salute Roque Santan Fernandes. Because Roque Santan Fernandes was the first Goan person who raised a voice against the entire system that was going on for years. When the governor appointed an advisory committee, Roque Santan Fernandes went to the governor and he asked him. He said, we were fighting the Portuguese to become free. We were fighting the Portuguese thinking that the common masses of Goa will get liberated. We were fighting because we felt that this common mass, which is called the Bahujan Samaj, will get its share in the administration. And here you governors are, you are constituting a committee which comprises people only from a certain community. This is not accepted. And he started a fast, for 5 days fast he started. After that, the central government had to dismiss that committee and government had to declare elections. The first way for elections was paved by the daring shown by Roque Santan Fernandes, I think, which we should not forget. So all these things have been mentioned in this book very vividly. But what I say is the element of continuity which should have been there between various communities also, it could have added another insight to it. Because see, when we say that in Goa, who comprises the Bahujan Samaj? Mostly it is the Naik Bandari Samaj, it is the Maratha Samaj, it is the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, it is the Kharvi Samaj, and all other small Bara Balutedar, Ajamijanga Mantat, those small Bara Balutedar communities, they comprise that. But they exist in other states also. They have a give and take in other states also. They exist in the belt of Konkan. They exist in the entire Karnataka. They exist in Kerala. They exist in Tamil Nadu. They exist in Andhra Pradesh. They exist in Madhya Pradesh. They exist in Chhattisgarh. And they exist in Bihar also. And there is an inherent link, the link which we have missed over the years because of Portuguese aggression. If we try to find these links, I think new vistas of Goan history and Goan anthropology can be opened up and we can have a better insight into this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wagh. I'll now invite Professor Arondekar to say something.
I'll keep my comments brief because I think my illustrious panelists have covered major ground. First, I want to congratulate Parag on what everyone, I think, has said very eloquently. Is a very important contribution. But in the spirit of making this a conversation, I wanted to think with you a little bit and ask you to think about some other possible avenues through which the contributions, particularly of Dayanand Bandodkar, could be thought about. So I thought about thinking about the prehistory of Bandodkar and the afterlife of Bandodkar. And what happens if you think about the prehistory of Bandodkar through the very conflicted history of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, which you talk about very briefly, and I understand, you know, the brevity because you were trying to cover a lot of questions. So in the spirit of magnifying that connection, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, as many people in this audience know, was a Goan Devadasi Samaj that was often called Bharatatil Ek Agresar Samaj. And the kinds of capital formations, the kinds of coalition politics that Bandodkar employs and you talk about are also very present in the Samaj's own conception of itself. So if you look at the histories of the Samaj from its formation in 1929 onwards, there is a lot of discussion around how to bring different constituencies within the Samaj, from the Bandis to the Kalavans to the Devlis, together in a pan-caste formation. So Bandodkar's sort of acumen that you speak about so eloquently emerges from its own positioning within a history of a Samaj, which is itself trying to understand its own multi and variegated caste formations. The other thing about the Samaj, which I think is relevant to the love-hate relationship that many have to Bandodkar. I was a Goan growing up in Bombay, my family is from Shiroda, so the relationship to Bandodkar was very complicated in the Samaj itself. People were not interested in Goan liberation. From my studying of the Samaj archives in state, unofficial biographies, they had a very conflicted relationship to liberation because the Goan state, in its Portuguese and colonial and post-colonial form, did not hold out any promise. So in some ways, as I said recently, Bandodkar was almost an anomaly. Right, his sort of relationship to post-colonial, the emergence of Liberation Goa, was not something that was seamlessly emerging out of the Samaj's oppositionality as a lower caste community. From what I have been studying, the Samaj was actually not interested in caste politics outside of its own formation. It was interested in its own reform, but not necessarily in allying with other Bahujan communities. I think this is clearly something that Bandodkar did, but it was incredibly problematic. And you see that post-Bandodkar as well. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj does not narrativize itself as a Bahujan Samaj, at least not in Goa. It certainly does in Maharashtra. It is not OBC in the same ways. So I think it is very important for us to deliberate on what it means for a figure as significant as Dayanand Bandodkar, who's associated with the emergence of a Bahujan Samaj, to himself be emerging from a community which itself did not see itself clearly in those lower caste terms. So I think it's important before we rush to, you know, build a little house where we put all our lower caste brothers in, to think about the conflicts that lie within those communities and the importance of sexuality and gender to these questions. And one of the things I've been reiterating is that oftentimes in the hagiographies of Bandodkar that we see, and I'm not suggesting that yours is, but many times there are, we skip over the fact that it is the important contributions of Devadasis, Kalavans, women who were not necessarily the Mogubai Murikar, but who were backup singers, who did the labors in the Devasthans, who continue to do that labor to this day, who are also part of this history of Goa that you're trying to write. So the first democratic revolution is incomplete without a history of sexuality. So, and Bandodkar is very central to that history. So I would sort of urge you, as you move forward in this very ambitious project, to think more capaciously about this category within these variegated landscapes that the Samaj itself was thinking itself and continues to do. As I said very jokingly to a panel that I did the other day, in Karnataka, in Hubli, I was doing research there. The Samaj members there call themselves the Saraswat Samaj. So when I went there to give a talk, I asked the chitnis, I said, Tumi, Swatala, why do you call yourself Saraswat Samaj? People are going to think you're Saraswats. And they said, no, we believe in the goddess Saraswati. We are followers of Saraswati, so why should we not call ourselves Saraswat Samaj? I think that's brilliant. why should knowledge only belong to the Brahmins? Who are we to say what Samaj can nominalize itself in what ways? So I think the kala of the Samaj is as important as the kalavant, right? So I would say one of the things to think about is that rich and very, very complex history. But thank you for a wonderful book, and I look forward to your new work.
Thank you, Anjali. I think, yes, before we allow Parag to maybe, and we will perhaps give you the last word, maybe we'll take a couple of questions. But before that, I just want to tie in some things that all of you have said. I want to take off from Professor Amin and Anjali, and both Professor Amin suggests that we should focus on the small histories and not just tag ourselves like this political march and push ourselves into certain affective communities. And you, Anjali, you speak about how the Gomantak Maratha Samaj is not necessarily interested in Goan liberation, it's interested in its liberation, in caste reform. And this is something that struck me when I was doing my own doctoral work, is that when citizenship is being formed, very often the citizens, we are not interested in the whole world being liberated and getting citizenship rights. We're interested in the little affective group, as it were, that we belong to. We're interested in their rights, right? And hence, we need to stop perhaps creating these larger frames of Goan, Indian, and just looking at more detailed histories and the way in which rights are being claimed. And having said that, I think the other point on which Professor Amin struck a bell with me is when he spoke about, talks about again not necessarily writing to an affective community. This is a major problem with work that gets done, even academic work that gets done in Goa, is that there's a presumption that no one outside of Goa is interested in Goa, and therefore we just speak within. There's a lot of navel gazing. To some extent, I think Parag does challenge this, but still there's still an encapsulation, as Professor Amin pointed out, of Goa and of India. And perhaps, as I keep saying, Goa now é país pequeno. Goa is not a small place. There's a way in which Goa can speak to much broader theoretical positions, which we should maybe take up. Mr. Wagh has made a huge number of points, but the one point I want to pick up on is when he says we need to salute Roch Santan Fernandes. Is very often the question has struck me is we keep referring to this date 1961 as liberation. I'm not really convinced that 1961 was in fact liberation, right? We've kept repeating this phrase that my colleague Bene has formulated, that Goa has become the colony of the post-colony, right? I think one of the things that your book moves towards creating argument for is that if there was liberation, it was perhaps in this period when Bandodkar was at the helm, and it created these opportunities for lower caste groups to assert themselves. And Roch Santan Fernandes is a part of that. And therefore I think this pointing out to Roch Santan Fernandes is important, because 61 to 63, as your book also shows, it's in fact status quo. The Indian state, the Congress government is in fact pushing the status quo, and therefore I think this book brings in some value. But I'm going to allow for 2 questions now, and then Parag can respond.
2 quick questions, please. Any questions from the audience?
I know very little actually about the period that Parag has studied, but I'm curious about how a party wins an election, but the question of the merger doesn't seem to have popular appeal. And I was wondering if you can just explain that in terms of what is the imaginary of the people, where they do seem to support this party, but they do not want to merge with Maharashtra. And what was the plan of the merger? What did it symbolize even for the party?
Mr. Wagh spoke about the counterparts of these smaller communities which were there in Goa, which were also in Maharashtra and Kerala, Tamil Nadu. So was the desire to merge into Maharashtra kind of connecting or unification or a reunification with those colonies which were the counterpart in Maharashtra? Was he trying to get back together?
I was wondering if we might also think about the limits of democracy itself. So I think that part of what Parag's book is trying to do is think about the rights-bearing subject and how that can be a limitation in and of itself.
So I'll take one by one. Rochelle's about the merger issue and all. Now, if you look at the book, this is what I've clearly talked about. Now, if you look at Bandodkar, though his party was very keen on taking Goa into Maharashtra, I don't find him as a very keen mergerist, because there are a number of no confidence motions passed against the government for not following up the merger. And there are three no confidence motions passed, and he's forced to resign and then take up the merger and all. So there is a sense of feeling among some MGP legislators and Praja Socialist Party largely that the support to the MGP was largely the support for the merger, and this is something Bandodkar was not prepared to accept. And if you look at the activists who were playing a leading role in the merger movement and all, for seeking Goa as an union territory, you find them mentioning Bandodkar as not a keen mergerist. This is something which is very interesting, because we normally fix Bandodkar to 1961, and there are two groups. We have the Hindu and the Catholic elites, who largely identify him for the merger, and the other side you have the Bahujan Samaj, who are carried away by his persona and philanthropy and all, and doesn't want to engage with the transformations that actually came about. So this work in that sense moved beyond that rhetoric and tried to engage with him as an agency in terms of the changes that came about eventually. Coming back to the merger, you also have this again activists who are playing a lead role, who have written about merger very directly, saying that he was not interested in merger, and towards the later part, okay, this is what they are saying, he had somehow toned down and he was not looking forward for merger and all. In fact, one of the prominent anti-mergerists says that when this was announced that Goa is now union territory, Bandodkar celebrated by playing cricket match and all. This is what is documented in one of the write-up. This is Ravind Kelekar who says, a very prominent personality. Bennett talking about limits of democracy in terms of what eventually happened. Now, what is very interesting is that if you look at the first three elections, you have low caste acquiring power through Bandodkar, which transformed Goa eventually in economic sense. You have land coming to them, employment opportunities came up and all. Economic transformations largely came about, so economic power was there, but that didn't translate into cultural changes. Now, if you look at in the popular imagination of Goa, the way we understand Goa, as Shri Vishnu Surya Wagh was trying to emphasize, is largely an elitist imagination. So culturally, if you try to look at, this has not taken place, and culture, I feel, is more powerful in terms of its continuity. And the dominance that operates through culture. Jason was talking about the land reforms and being in very important and liberation happening around 1964. That day I was attending launch of Amita, and Amita was mentioning about Tirakol. Tirakol is the heart of the protest nowadays, and Alito just forwarded me one write-up, which is by it's by an Munkar who belongs to Tirakol, and then he talks about how Badkars exploited them. There was no notion of human subject in terms of a Munkar, and then he writes there, it is Babu Sahib who gave liberation to us in 1964 through his land reforms, and this is written in Romi Kokni in a church magazine Very recently this has come up. So land reforms are very, very important because this eventually transformed Goa. Land is not directly connected to productivity. Land was largely related to status. And destruction of this feudal relationship eventually, if I can borrow Amartya Sen's ideas, went on to enforce human capabilities, transforming the lower caste to retain land and move out to different places. Now when you talk about the history of a Bahujan and trying to think that you need to have a continuous narrative, that's difficult. History is often seen as what Professor Shahid, Amin often says, as a subject of plenitude. You want everything into it, and that's difficult when you talk about when you're dealing with communities who has not kept record clear. When you look at the other communities in terms of the upper caste and all, so there are a lot of silences with which you need to engage. So if you look at this work, if you go through first 2 chapters and all, it's not a one history of Goa that I talk about. There are many histories that are talked about. So in fact, almost all major communities are discussed. It may be a Catholic Brahmin, it may be a Shardo, you have a Saraswat, Hindu Saraswats and all. You have Karvis, you have Gomantak Maratha, you have Bandari and all these communities and how they identify themselves with Shivaji, Maratha symbol evolving and all around the late 19th century. These are talked about, and how Bandodkar then plays a very important role in getting all these communities together. So I find that there is a value in looking at the fragments of history rather than writing in continuous narrative and all and falling in the old nationalist trap. When we talk about the relationship of Gomantak Maratha Samaj with Bahujan Samaj, that's again complex, because when you talk about Gomantak Maratha Samaj, you have number of communities in it, and all didn't identify themselves with the Bahujan Samaj. There were others who did identify. So the archive that we talk about in Mumbai that came about was largely belonging to those who were into performing arts, who made a name and all in Bombay and all, largely. But there were others when you talk about, so it's a complex community that we are talking about. Now what is very interesting is that now there is, in 4 or 5 months back, there is a demand for OBC status which has come up. This is what the newspapers have carried. Now when you look at caste, and this is where I'll then pass it on to Shri Vishnu Surya Wagh. When you look at caste, I feel that caste have a tendency to become class, but this may not eventually happen. And therefore, when it becomes a class, there is a tendency to mask the caste, and this is where the problem comes. Okay.
So all said and done, Parag has explained his position or his view as a writer. I would like to put only one point. Bahu Sahib took some very pragmatic steps. One of that was to provide education to the Bahujan Samaj, to the remotest of the village. That's where he took the schools, and that's why Goa still remembers him now. Second was the initiative he had taken to make the Land to the Tiller Act, which freed the people out of bondage. In my opinion, he could have done one more thing, which would have put an end to the entire feudal thinking that's been going on in Goa's social circle. That one piece of act was the Reglement de Mahajaniya Qaida. The Mahajan Act, which was there, which Portuguese introduced in 1886 for the benefit of certain people, which was a draconian act, which took away the temples and the lands of the common masses away and vested all these powers into the hands of one community, which could have been abolished. Till now, that dream remains unfulfilled. I think the day we abolish this Mahajaniya Act, because it's not draconian in the sense that it's sexually also, that act heaps a lot of injustice on the women. Women have no right in temple committees. Now, if a high caste Saraswat marries a low caste girl, he is allowed to enter into the sanctum sanctorum of the temple, but his wife is not allowed. If they get children, then his son is allowed, but his mother is not allowed. allowed just because she is low caste. I think all this hierarchy has to be demolished. We have to make a very pragmatic law. Babu Sahib didn't do it. I think it's for us to do in the next coming years.
That's great. The great thing about unfulfilled dreams is it allows you to have a vision for the future. So speaking of the future, I will now give this floor over to Vivek Menezes to take us onward.